Hi, it's your favorite history teacher, Mr. Thomas, here today to talk to you about the French Revolution, a 10-year time period in which the absolute government of France is removed, along with the king's head, and new governments are going to be placed in there instead. Now, I'm going to have this video as part one of a 3-video series, and this one is going to cover the beginnings of the French Revolution up to and including the Great Fear. Now, let me minimize myself into the corner, and there we go, and get started. For part one, we're looking at the ancient regime, 1788 and before. This is going to be the time period of France under absolutist rule. And the king who is in power at the time of the French Revolution is Louis XVI. Now, if you take a look at this picture down here below, it should look somewhat familiar to you because it's very similar to the picture of Louis XIV that you guys had seen before. Now, Louis XIV was this charismatic, quintessential example of an absolute monarch, and Louis XVI just didn't have that same charisma. He did get married to an Austrian woman, Marie Antoinette, who will be his queen and mother of his children. Let me minimize myself completely and move on. Now, the ancient regime is this time period prior to the revolution, and under this regime, you had the king appointing intendants, that some people refer to as petty tyrants, who held power in the 30 districts inside France. Now, these intendants could appoint judges, they controlled justice, they could also imprison anybody at any time for any reason by issuing a lettre de cachet. Now, these letters did not need to cite any particular reason that somebody's going to get thrown in prison, they would just simply put that person into prison. No trial, no rights or due process or anything along those lines. And it was a way that the king would use to control people that might have been speaking out against him. Under the old regime, the economics of France were pretty simple. It's based on agriculture. The peasants farmed and they paid most of the taxes. Now, in this time period, France is divided up into 3 different estates. In the first estate, you had the clergy. These were people of the church, the high-ranking people, so think cardinals and bishops and archbishops. They only made up 1% of the population of France, but they controlled about 10% or so of the land, and they paid no taxes whatsoever. Once a year, they would give a royal gift in lieu of taxes, but that gift was not a requirement. The second estate, who you see in the middle of those 3 figures, they are members of the nobility. Now, the king himself is actually not considered part of the estate system at all. He is considered outside the estate system. But the nobility, think of like dukes and marquises and whatnot, they're representing about 2% of the population. They paid very little in taxes, and they held a lot of government positions. They owned about 25% of the land. Now, the last estate, the third estate, is everyone else, about 97% of the population. These could be the peasants in the countryside, the working poor inside the cities, and the wealthy bourgeoisie, which is a fancy word that just simply means the well-to-do middle class. Think like doctors and lawyers and merchants, people like that. The bourgeoisie made up about 5% of the third estate, and the rest, 92%, was mostly peasants. These people had a tough time, and they paid the vast majority of the taxes inside France. Now, the 3-estate system, there are many different cartoons that talk about them, but if you look at this, it's an interesting little cartoon that really shows the 3 estates at work. Over here, with letter A, and then B, and then C, and then D, you ought to be able to tell exactly who they are. So, for instance, D, I'm going to work from the bottom on the way up. D is probably the easiest one. Look at him. He's in chains, he's skinny, he's doing all the work, and these other people are getting a free ride. This has got to be members of the third estate, especially those peasants. Letter C. It's the person who is in charge. They are the ones with their hand on the reins, if you'd call that, and the bit is in the third estate's mouth. This must be the person outside the estate system. It is none other than Louis XVI. As for B, the big giveaway is this hat known as a mitre, as well as the cross down here. It is members of the first estate. And of course, letter A has to be the nobility. The meaning? I hope is quite obvious at this point in time. The third estate is doing all the work, and the others are getting a free ride off of them. As for long-term causes of the French Revolution, one of them is simply absolutism itself. That idea of the divine right of kings, where God had appointed kings to rule on earth and gave them complete power, that power certainly caused some of those kings to become corrupt. The three estate system itself is an unequal system. The first and second estate did not pay much, if anything, in taxes, and all of the burden, all the tax burden, went on to the third estate. The Palace of Versailles, even though it was expanded greatly under Louis XIV, who had died in 1715, it is still an astronomical cost. It is taking up as much as 25% of the revenue of the French government. Maintaining the court at Versailles was expensive. Of course, the Enlightenment plays a role too. The philosophers, many of which were French, were starting to question beliefs. They questioned absolutism. They questioned the established beliefs and traditions. They wanted to find if there was some better way to run a government. The same way that scientists look for natural laws that regulated the universe, the philosophers are going to look for any kind of series of laws or systems that could work in government and administer justice. And of course, there are revolutions as well. The Glorious Revolution in England showed that a country could get rid of an absolute monarch and replace it with a limited constitutional monarchy. And the French themselves helped to finance the American Revolution that was based in large part off of Enlightenment ideas. The idea that people are born free and equal in rights, except maybe slaves, and that the government's job was to protect people's life and liberty and, well, I almost said property, but we changed it to pursuit of happiness. I like this chart right here, which is also why it's on your note sheet, because it has a good breakdown of the long-term causes of the French Revolution. Short-term causes, and there were many, really come from a couple of different areas, one of which, of course, is being economic in nature. The French government was deficit spending. In other words, it was spending more money each year than it actually took in tax revenue. As this goes on year after year after year, their debt increases dramatically. And the French government had had so much debt that it was almost impossible to borrow any more money from any banks. They simply were in too deep a debt to get any more revenue to fund the system the way it had been funded for decades. Queen Marie Antoinette, there's a good picture of her right there. Her nickname was Madame Deficit because she, as a young woman, had spent lavishly on weird hairstyles, and you'll see pictures of those in a second, elaborate jewels, gambling, putting on plays, and the one job of a king and a queen is to produce heirs, and there were no heirs produced in the first 7 years of their marriage. Eventually there will be some, but the damage had been done without producing any babies in the first several years when they were married. Here's some pictures of those unusual hairstyles. I do personally love the boat. I think that is just a fashion that should come back. Yeah, Marie Antoinette even decided to go slumming it with her peasant cottage, which is tremendously expensive, and it is not representative of the type of structures that peasants would live in. Here's a good picture of her and the royal children a number of years later. Like I said, she did not have any kids for the first 7 years of their marriage, but eventually Louis and Marie Antoinette would have several children, and you can see several of them right there. Now, another short-term cause is going to be really, really bad harvests. In 1788 specifically, there was a drought and the price of bread skyrocketed because of that. In 1787, a French person living in a city would spend about half their income on bread. By 1788, the price had increased dramatically and went up to 80% of their income. They got into an unhappy choice of, do I feed myself or do I pay my taxes? Which for most people is a pretty simple answer. You feed yourself and you don't pay the taxes. The financial crisis came to a head and got worse. Several people tried to develop a plan to get France out of the financial situation that they were in. High ranking nobles and church officials, members of the First and Second Estate, in other words, resisted any kind of tax or land reforms. They knew that they had a really good deal and they wanted to keep it going for as long as possible. Jacques Necker is an important person during this stage of the French Revolution because he's a finance minister who's popular with the Third Estate because his position is that the government's job is to make sure that people had enough food to eat. And in the midst of the bread crisis, there really wasn't enough. And Jacques Necker seemed to be the one person that was speaking truth to power, and the Third Estate loved him for it. He also reported that so much of the revenue of the country of France went to the favorite people at courts and pensions for nobility, rather than using that money to help the poor. He did support changes to taxation, and he gets fired by Louis XVI. He later gets rehired, but the fact that he was saying, I want to have a system in which the First and Second Estate are going to pay some taxes was really unpopular with those members of the First and Second Estate. The nobles themselves wanted the restoration of their rights. They didn't like the intendants that had been developed under Louis XIV, and they refused to pay any kind of new taxes that wasn't approved by the Estates General. Now, when the bankers of 1788 refused to loan the government any more money, there's a picture of Jacques Necker there, turmoil over taxation. Louis calls for a meeting of that Estates General to try and find a solution to this bankruptcy problem. Now, the Estates General was a group that was representing all three estates, and each estate would send hundreds of members to represent their estate's interests. Now, this had not met in 175 years, but it was time to do it. In order to prep for this meeting of the Estates General, Louis XVI allowed for caches de doléances. In other words, my French is awful, I know. In other words, a list of grievance that each estate could bring to the meetings. It was going to set the agenda, give them topics to talk about. Now, these are going to be used by the Third Estate to bring their grievances about taxation and unfair practices and old feudal laws to the attention of the rest of the estates. Now, the meetings begin on the 5th of May, 1789. But you have to talk about voting issues here. The First and Second Estate favored the traditional way that the Estates General would vote, in which each estate would have one vote. It didn't matter how many representatives were sent, the estate as a total had one vote. Now, the First and Second Estates knew that they had a great under the old regime, so they would always vote as a block. In other words, they would vote together to prevent the Third Estate from passing any reforms. Now, obviously, if you're a member of the Third Estate, you hate this and you want to do something different. So, Louis tries a new little technique here to see if it will help to alleviate some of this trouble. The Third Estate was allowed to be doubled. They were allowed to elect twice as many representatives as the other estates. However, Louis was hoping that they would be happy with more representation, but still one vote. The Third Estate, however, really wanted each representative to have a single vote. And that way, with the doubling of the third, they could outvote the other estates. So here's a graphic graphic representation of what would happen. The three estates themselves, you can see here, the First Estate in orange represents 1% of the population. The Second Estate in yellow is 2%, and the Third Estate, 97%. What the Third Estate was looking for was to have the First Estate, with their 296 votes, represent part of the Estates General. The Second Estate, with their 282 votes, represent another part of the Estates General. And the Third Estate, with 610, represent the rest. Instead of being one vote per, the Third Estate wanted one vote per representative, in which case the Third Estate could always outvote the other two combined. If you're a member of the First or Second Estate, you hate this. Hence, National Assembly coming on up. The estates argued over issues for several weeks, but by June, members of the Third Estate and a handful from the First and Second declare themselves the National Assembly. In other words, they're saying, enough's enough. We actually have to do something. We don't want to just simply argue anymore. Let's actually take some action. Now, the members of the National Assembly declare themselves, and Louis XVI refuses to even meet with them and has them locked out of the meetings of the Estates General. The National Assembly is upset by this. They're locked out of the meetings. The king is not talking to them. So they went ahead and went off on their own. They met in the one spot where they could, a tennis court. And they took an oath there on June the 20th, 1789. You can see the oath. Decrees that all members of this assembly shall immediately take a solemn oath not to separate and to reassemble wherever circumstances require until the constitution of the kingdom is established and consolidated upon firm foundations. And that, the said oath taken, all members and each one of them individually shall ratify this steadfast resolution by their signature. In other words, they got locked out of the Estates General, met in an area that was big enough to hold them all, and promised with this oath to continue to meet until France had a written constitution. Now, this written constitution should and did scare the bejesus out of Louis XVI, because any written constitution is going to limit his power. He will no longer be an absolutist. So, if you're Louis, you're not in favor of this. Jacques-Louis David is a painter, and he paints this depiction of the tennis court oath happening here. And you can see people on the inside. This guy is swearing the tennis court oath. I love how the wind has come on in, and you can see the lights shining down as if God himself has blessed this endeavor. Louis didn't want this written constitution, and he gathered up military forces around his palace at Versailles and around Paris to use against this National Assembly. When that happens, the people of Paris are rather upset, to put it mildly, especially since some of the military forces were recruited from other countries. They were mercenaries. Louis himself didn't trust 100% of his army to obey his orders, because so much of the military belonged to the Third Estate. The people of Paris organized themselves into a national guard, a sort of militia, and they created a government for the city called the Commune. Now, Louis XVI has fired Jacques Necker again, and this is seen as a move against the National Assembly. It is definitely one of those big steps on the way to the storming of the Bastille. The Bastille itself was once a fortress. It got turned into a prison, and the people of the city of Paris had seized over 28,000 guns. Now, they had taken most of these from a veterans hospital that was also used as an armory. However, the person in charge of those weapons had seen the writing on the wall, knew that there could be some kind of an uprising or revolt, so he had sent several dozen barrels of gunpowder on over to the Bastille for safer keeping because of its fortress-like nature. Now, the people had the guns, they needed the gunpowder, and on July the 14th, 1789, they went for it. They stormed the Bastille, trying to get those barrels and barrels and barrels of gunpowder. Now, the guards at the Bastille, while they were in negotiations, the leader of the Bastille was a fellow by the name of the Marquis de Launay. While they were negotiating with the crowd, and de Launay was trying to figure out what to do, there were some people that snuck into the inner wall of the Bastille that cut down the ropes that were holding up the drawbridge, which actually smashed one of the attackers and killed him. People ran across the drawbridge and got into the inner circle of the Bastille. Soldiers started firing in the chaos. You got 98 attackers that were killed and only one defender. Think about the defenders. They are veteran soldiers, and they were the ones in the best defensive positions. The commanding officer, the Marquis de Launay, tried to organize some sort of resistance that failed, and he knew that he would never be able to hold back the crowd without either A, killing large numbers of them, or B, trying to come up with some way to get some food and water into that Bastille because there really wasn't that many. Ultimately, he surrenders. That was really about the only option that he had, and he gets pulled away. And as he's getting pulled away, he's beaten and really attacked by the crowd to the point where he just simply said, "If you're going to do it, let me die." And they did. They killed him, and they cut off his head, and they stuck it onto a pike. The crowd storms into the rest of the Bastille prison. They set forth 7 prisoners, 2 of which were mentally ill. They set forth and got those prisoners freed. And within 6 months, the entire structure itself gets completely and utterly demolished. Some of the materials, the stones that built up the walls, were used as a bridge. Others were taken as souvenirs and given out as these little emblems of freedom that the French Revolution would hand out to people. There's a nice depiction of it. You'll even notice, if you pay attention here, not just the fires and whatnot, but you can see the surrender flag up here at the top. But there are several cannon down here at the bottom, and that's because some of the Royal Guard had switched sides and joined the side of the crowd. This is the first bloodshed in the French Revolution and the first beheading, but by far will it be the last. The storming of the Bastille led to other smaller uprisings in the countryside. Now, the Bastille occurs in the city of Paris, but the peasants in the countryside hear about what's going on and they rise up and they attack the homes of the nobles. And many of those homes get burnt and nobles are attacked. The idea behind it, of course, is to take some vengeance against the injustices that the peasants had to endure, but also a more practical one is those noble homes kept the records of what feudal dues and taxes had been around, and if you burn the homes and you burn those records, you're going to eliminate a lot of your debt. Many nobles at this point in time flee the country. If they're able to, they get into their carriages and they go, and they become known as the émigrés. They're the nobles that flee France during the course of the French Revolution. Heck, King Louis XVI's brother was one of them. I'm going to stop right here at the end of the Great Fear. I'm going to continue on with part 2 a little bit later. Thanks very much for listening.